Welcome again to ParaMOOC 2019. This is the last substantive presentation of this year's ParaMOOC. As you remember, it's Parapsychology Research and Education. We've been running since 2015. This year's theme is Survival of Death in Parapsychology. The enrollment closes on May 31st. Anybody who enrolls before May 31st will have access to all of the course materials until April of 2020 and possibly a bit longer. I'm also setting up a Google Doc, which hasn't got a Google Drive spot that hasn't finished just yet. Once that's up, you'll have access to that for indefinitely. And all of the MP4s and all that stuff will be up there. Welcome, Esther. So we've got 20 people now. Before we get started, I would like to say thank you to Radiant Skies, the artist from 123rf.com, who did this Wordle and many more. We licensed this one for our ParaMOOC course. And I would also like to say a shout out to the Parapsychology Foundation. Lisa Coley, the president of the Parapsychology Foundation, has been supporting the MOOC since 2016 and was our major donor in 2015, and she will be supporting the MOOC again next year. So that's wonderful. We're very grateful. I'd also like to give a shout out to Brian Williams, who's our Intrepid Discussion Forum co-moderator and the research director at Psychical Research Foundation. He's not joining us today because the New Mexico Paranormal Group meets on Saturday, so he'll be in that meeting instead. But he will be with us tomorrow for the closing session. So today we're going to have a post-mortem survival, the central issues by the philosopher, Dr. Stephen E. Braude, who you see in the frame. He's an Emeritus Professor and former Chair of Philosophy at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He is past president of the Parapsychological Association, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Scientific Exploration, and the recipient of numerous grants and awards, including a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Distinguished Achievement Award from the International Society for the Study of Dissociation, and the F.W.H. Memorial Medal from the Society for Psychical Research. He's also published 6 books, all of them which you should read and have in your library, and nearly 100 philosophical and scientific articles. Today's talk, the abstract for today's talk is: most people either underestimate or overestimate the evidence suggesting the persistence of personal consciousness after bodily death. Those who underestimate don't realize how impressive the best cases are. Those who overestimate don't realize how difficult it is to rule out explanations other than survival. We'll look closely at the major issues. So here is your PowerPoint, Stephen, and I think you've been down at the bottom to
right.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll get out of
lurk at the bottom all the time.
I think I do too, actually. Okay. Well, I'll get out of your way and have at it. The floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Please bear with me today. I'm doing this unexpectedly early, and I'm still in my jammies. So, while I have a cup of coffee, let's see if I can be lucid. Well, as Nan just said, some think the evidence for survival is worse than it is. They just don't realize how good the best cases are and how difficult it is to explain them away in normal, or at least non-survivalist terms. And others overestimate the data of survival and think it's better than it really is, and they don't appreciate how difficult it is to rule out other explanations, especially those claiming that nothing's going on except exotic and maybe paranormal things done by the living. So let's plunge right in. The question I think we need to be asking, this to me is the relevant question, is the following: is there or can there be scientifically compelling evidence of, or an otherwise rational basis for belief in, survival of bodily death? That's a very specific question. I'm not asking whether there's personally compelling evidence, but whether there's scientifically compelling evidence. Now, what do we mean by survival? Let's get clear about that, first of all. When parapsychologists address this topic, they're not interested in what Eastern religions often discuss, that is, a kind of merging with the infinite, or a kind of being in general, that is, absorbing one's own personal consciousness into a grander soup of universal consciousness. That isn't what talk about survival is all about, because that kind of life after death would obliterate our identity and whatever is distinctive about us. So when parapsychologists talk about survival of death in that sense is something that preserves some kind of identity between a living individual and a post-mortem individual. For example, an identity between a mediumistic communicator and a formerly living person, or in cases of reincarnation, a previous personality and a living child. That's why people who wonder about survival wonder about such things as whether they will be able to meet up with their deceased relatives, whether they will communicate with the still living members of their families, or carry out vendettas against their enemies, or pursue old interests, or just enjoy a post-mortem existence in which they simply get their hair back. So in other words, they wonder whether they will continue to exist in some form or another after bodily death. And they wonder whether that future individual bears something like the same relationship to their present self that their present self bears to their physically and psychologically remote infant self. I mean, the difference between the infant Stephen Braude and the adult chronologically challenged Stephen Braude are considerable. I mean, even from moment to moment, we go through many, many different changes. So when we talk about identity, we're speaking about identity in a kind of loose and philosophical sense. And that's the kind of identity, or something like that, that we posit when we talk about survival after bodily death. Except that in the case of post-mortem survival, we're dealing with situations where the original body isn't simply different, it's decayed and disappeared. So that's why we look for personal survival cases showing persisting anomalous knowledge or idiosyncratic interests or skills, the kinds of things that suggest that what was distinctive about us in our living days is still distinctive about us in our post-mortem days. This is even recognized widely in cartoons. So here a dog at the pearly gates is asking, is there any chance of getting my testicles back? Or why the ghost here says, or the woman says to the ghost, it's over, Harry. This one, I belong to the Audubon Society. So when parapsychologists address the topic of postmortem survival, they generally acknowledge that a case suggests life after death when, first of all, some living person shows knowledge or abilities closely, if not uniquely, associated with the deceased person. And second, we have good reason to believe that this knowledge wasn't obtained or the abilities developed through ordinary means. That's why so-called drop-in communication is considered very suggestive, because, as you may know, during seances, sometimes uninvited guests come through the medium. I mean, mostly people go to seances for very specific reasons, to contact deceased friends or relatives, but sometimes uninvited guests show up. And in the best cases of drop-ins, the identity of the drop-in is unknown to the people at the seance. The drop-in will make subsequently verified claims about himself or herself, which nobody at the seance knew to be true. And the drop-in's behavior, as expressed through the medium, resembles that of the communicator when alive. Now, there are a few cases that have these qualities. I'm not going to take the time to discuss them now, but they're in the literature, like Runkey's leg is probably the most famous. But perhaps the most important feature of a good drop-in case is that it makes most sense psychologically from the drop-in's perspective. And what I mean by that is that in the best cases, the communicator's agenda, the communicator's entire motive for communicating, seems both greater and clearer than any motivation we might attribute to the medium or to the sitter or any other living person. Now, that's not always an easy thing to unravel, and that's why people debate about these cases. But this is the kind of thing that makes a drop-in case seem, at least superficially, to be persuasive and compelling, or at least inviting. So what are our options in trying to explain the evidence from survival if we don't want to adopt the survival hypothesis? The first line of argument would be to posit what I call the usual suspects. And these would be, first of all, mistakes in observation, or mistakes in reporting, or outright fraud, or hidden memories on the part of the medium or other relevant people. Now, the best cases are the best cases precisely because the usual suspects can't explain them away. So we can forget about the usual suspects. But that leaves plenty of options. If we want to explain away in more or less normal terms the evidence for survival, another option would be what I call the unusual suspects. And here we have to posit rare or abnormal processes. It might be, for example, a combination of dissociation on the part of the medium and latent creative capacities on the part of the medium or a child in a reincarnation case. And this is not a trivial issue, and it's one that isn't taken sufficiently seriously by many writers on survival who don't know the literature on dissociation, who haven't studied the literature on savants and prodigies and other forms of latent creative capacities. And I'll say a little bit more about this later. Another possibility would be relying on exceptional memory, so that the medium, let's say, actually had encountered the relevant information that is subsequently verified about the deceased, but didn't realize that he or she had remembered it. And another option would be extreme or rare forms of savantism. And I'll talk more about that, as I said. The last kind of, let's call it another form of the unusual suspects, but this is to posit what some people call Super Psi. I hate that term, and I'll explain why in a moment. I prefer the expression living agent Psi. There are two options there. I don't think we need to get into that now, but I'll be happy to come back to it. A, if I wake up, and two, if somebody wants me to. So what's wrong with the term Super Psi? Well, first of all, it's unclear. That is, what's super for one person may not be so super for another. We don't have any kind of credible scale of impressiveness in the case of psi phenomena, and so it's needlessly evaluative. And as Charles Richet once noted, it's as difficult to understand the materialization of a single finger as it would be to understand the materialization of an entire living entire body, which moves around as if it's a living person. I mean, both are inexplicable in any terms we currently understand, and both are equally impressive from a scientific point of view. Another problem is that I think there's a kind of prejudicial meaning built into the expression Super Psi. It's the difference between saying somebody's a superhero and saying that something is super glue. When we talk about a superhero, we're presupposing that there's something inherently implausible about what's super about this individual. But we all understand what we mean by super glue. It's just really fine glue, really great glue. But I think the people who talk about Super Psi use the term super more like it's used in the expression superhero than in the expression super glue. So I prefer to stick with the term coined by Michael Sudduth, living agent Psi, which is more accurately descriptive and doesn't build in any kind of suspicious and maybe question-begging meaning about the nature of the term super. Now, why is it difficult to rule out living agent Psi? Let me get some coffee first. One problem is this. Let's say a medium provides some obscure information, and that information can be verified. If the information provided by a medium can be verified, then it can be explained in terms of the medium's ESP, just as a matter of principle. So let's think about this. What is ESP? Well, the two basic forms of ESP would be telepathy and clairvoyance. What is telepathy? That's simply a form of direct mind-to-mind interaction. And what is clairvoyance? That's direct awareness of, or response to, physically remote events. So consider the following. Suppose a medium says, "Uncle Harry knows you're eager to quit your job and become a circus clown." There are some crucial questions we have to ask if that's true about you. First of all, how does the medium know what Uncle Harry is thinking? And how does Uncle Harry know what you're feeling? That has to be explained in terms of telepathy, some kind of mind-to-mind interaction with the deceased. Or suppose a medium says, "Uncle Harry says he's glad you're wearing the necklace he gave you." Now, how would Uncle Harry know that? It can only be explained in terms of clairvoyance, Uncle Harry's ability to know what the state of the physical world is, so that Uncle Harry knows you're wearing the necklace he gave you. So this is important because what it means is that after-death communication actually requires impressive ESP, and probably as impressive as what we would posit if we were to revert to a living agent explanation. The living agent psi explanation posits ESP between the medium and the sitter, or maybe the medium and distant objects. Whereas survival psi posits ESP in these cases between the medium and Uncle Harry, or Uncle Harry and you, or Uncle Harry and a physical object. But it's positing psi in either case. And we have no sensible grounds for saying that one is more impressive than the other. There is an argument that's often made. It's a terrible argument. I call it the sore thumb argument. And it goes like this. Two premises. First, the evidence for ESP and PK suggests that these phenomena occur only to a modest degree. Second premise, but living agent psi accounts for the better survival cases require prodigious psychic abilities. Therefore, living agent psi explanations posit degrees of psychic functioning for which we have no other evidence. So let's take a look at this crappy argument. Just focus on the first premise, that the evidence for ESP and PK suggests that these phenomena occur only to a modest degree. One obvious problem is that there's excellent evidence from remote viewing cases for very refined ESP and from physical mediumship cases for massive PK. And besides, as I already mentioned, there's no clear standard for measuring degrees of psychic impressiveness. And there's another more abstract issue, and that is that there's no present justification, given how little we know about psi, and there's very little we know about it. There's no present justification for imposing any limits whatsoever on psychic functioning. You can't open the door, even just as a thought experiment, to the paranormal and then decide arbitrarily to open it only a crack. At our current level of ignorance, which is considerable, if we're opening the door to the possibility of paranormal functioning, until we have good solid evidence for specifying limits on psychic functioning, we have to open it all the way. And we don't know enough to say that the door can be opened only this much or this much. Now, even if we grant the lack of a clear standard for measuring psychic impressiveness, I hear you out there asking, does the living agent psi hypothesis require much more psi or more refined psi than the survival psi hypothesis? Let's look at a case. Because the answer seems to be that survivalists are committed to positing comparably impressive psi involving the deceased simply in order to explain how the evidence of survival was manifested in the first place. So how many of you know about the Morochi case? This concerned the manifestation of very high and arguably grandmaster level chess played by someone with, as far as we can tell, little or no knowledge of the game, and similar to the level of skill of a deceased Hungarian grandmaster. Could it be explained in terms of living agent psi? Well, consider the following. First of all, the medium was playing with an opponent who had grandmaster skills, so the specter of telepathic influence can't be ruled out. The idiosyncratic moves of the deceased, chess moves of the deceased, were verifiable and available by ESP to both players. And the grandmaster opponent and others were aware of the deceased's ignorance of recent developments in chess, especially some moves to counter moves that Morochi would have been likely to use. Now, here's what Vernon Neppe had to say about this case. This is how he tried to rule out the possibility of a living agent psi explanation. He said, living agent ESP requires the repeated and active cogitation of a master chess player or players, extended over a prolonged period of time, with 47 different responses, 47 moves in the game. But survival requires nothing but interaction between the medium and a deceased communicator, retaining at least some of his former embodied faculties. I think it's an extremely weak argument, and I think Neppe should have known better. And here's the reason. Ask yourself this question: how can the deceased be responsible for 47 chess moves? That's only if the deceased uses repeated and accurate ESP. First of all, either telepathy with the medium or an onlooker, or else clairvoyance of the chessboard, simply to know what the state of play is, so that the deceased could know what the next move should be. And then we have to posit, if we're arguing for survival psi, ongoing and effective ESP, presumably telepathic influence on the medium, to convey the desired next move. That's a hell of a lot of survival psi. And we, again, have no standard, no credible standard for saying that's more or less impressive than what the living agent psi explanation posits. So I would say the moral here is that extensive, prolonged, and refined ESP, for this case, is required on both the survival and living agent psi hypotheses. And that's why the appeal to simplicity or parsimony in a case like this just does not work. Now, there's another issue that's been mentioned in the last several years, resurrected in part by Michael Sudduth. And it's this. Many survivalists argue that the survivalist explanation is simpler or has greater explanatory power, or that it does a better job of predicting the data than the living agent psi alternative. But the usual argument for saying this is, in fact, logically flawed. And here's the problem. The mere hypothesis of survival, that is, simply saying that survival of consciousness in some form can persist after bodily death, that can make no predictions whatsoever about the form the data will take. The only way a survivalist can make any predictions at all about what this survival evidence should look like would be by adopting numerous auxiliary assumptions about the nature and the character of the afterlife. And those assumptions are not independently verified. For example, in mediumistic cases, there's a lot to explain because there are very interesting features of the evidence. We need to explain, if we have a decent theory of what's going on, we need to explain why communications are often trite, hazy, dreamlike, or confused, but at other times clear and coherent. We need to explain why only some people communicate, and then only for a short time. Those are just two outstanding features of the evidence. But to explain these features and other features of mediumship, We need to make currently unverified assumptions about, for example, whether the dead would want to communicate or whether they would be able to communicate, and how they would do this, and whether the process is easy or not, and why it's easy or not. Only then can we make any specific predictions at all about what we would expect to find if survival were the case. But a simple survival hypothesis that is a mere assertion that consciousness or personality can survive, in the absence of further assumptions specifying conditions allowing the evidence to take the forms noted in the literature, a simple survival hypothesis can make no specific, much less fine-grained predictions at all about what the data of survival should actually look like. Now, of course, the living agent psi hypothesis has the same problem. It has to make assumptions about why the living would be motivated to simulate evidence of survival. That is, whose conscious or unconscious needs would be served by the appearance of evidence for survival. And that, by the way, is a question that most writers on survival don't even bother to ask. Now, as Michael Sudduth has noted, when survivalists try to claim that the survival hypothesis explains or predicts the evidence better than the living agent psi hypothesis, they do something logically sneaky. They compare robust versions of the living agent psi hypothesis, that is, those laden with various assumptions about motives for simulating evidence of survival. They compare that only to a simple survival hypothesis, that is, minus the sorts of assumptions needed for that hypothesis to do any explanatory work at all. But the logically admirable thing to do would be to compare a robust survival and a robust living agent psi hypothesis, where each one is bulked up by assumptions permitting the prediction of the observed fine-grained features of the data. So the actual situation that I think we find ourselves in is that the empirical argument for survival may amount merely to a comparison of competing auxiliary assumptions of the living agent psi and survivalist hypotheses, because it's the only way you're going to get any of those two hypotheses to do any predicting or explanatory work whatsoever. So what else bothers me about the literature on survival? Well, I'm particularly bugged by the inadequate treatment of dissociation. Especially when the people writing in favor of the survival hypothesis are psychologists or psychiatrists, and they display a shocking ignorance of this data. First of all, there's plenty of evidence from the literature on hypnosis and multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder, indicating that dissociation elicits or accompanies psychic functioning. Also, there's a very obvious set of similarities between multiple personality and mediums or channels. I'm not saying the two are the same, but it shows why investigating those similarities is not just a trivial matter. So you think that mastery of the literature on dissociation seems to be a prerequisite for interpreting the survival evidence. And one of my standard complaints about Ian Stevenson's work, for example, although it's a valuable repository of data, is that when Stevenson tries to consider whether one of the unusual suspects might just as well explain the data, or whether the living agent psi hypothesis might do the trick, he doesn't really take dissociation seriously, nor does he treat the people in the survival cases, the reincarnation cases, as anything but psychological stick figures. I can go into that in more detail if you like, and if I can wake up. It also bothers me that writers ignore crucial issues concerning the nature and limits of human abilities, not just dissociation, but also the extensive literature on savants and prodigies. This comes up in connection with the apparent persistence of abilities in mediumistic and reincarnation cases, where a medium might show distinctive knowledge of domains of knowledge that were characteristic of the deceased, but which the medium had no access to normally. Or when a child in a reincarnation case seems to show some abilities, including linguistic abilities that seem anomalous. Fact is, most of the writers on survival who address these topics don't know the literature on second language acquisition. They don't know the literature on savants and prodigies. They haven't really paid close attention to some of the outstanding features of the literature on savants and prodigies. That's why my book, Immortal Remains, went into those topics in nauseating detail. I mean, it's significant, for example, in the case of savants, that savants can display abilities without requiring an appeal to survival, which are dramatically discontinuous with their normal deficits, the deficits that they ordinarily display. For example, there are calculating savants who can factor any number you give to them, but who can't add the change in their pocket. There's a famous musical savant who's spastic until he sits down to play the piano. So given the deficits that these people display, you wouldn't expect them to have the abilities they display either. And until we grasp what's going on there, and we don't really, we're in no position to say that the anomalous abilities shown in survival cases, which are usually much less impressive than what we see in savants, require any appeal to survival. There's also very interesting literature on intelligent or gifted underachievers and how that figures in as a complex issue, which, if you want to see how that works, I suggest you look at the limits of, Immortal Remains. It's that book. This is the sleazy promotional part of my presentation today. It goes into some of these living agent psi alternatives in more detail than I think any other book dealing with the topic of survival. I come out in favor of the literature on survival, but what I try to do in this book is to elevate the discussion to a level at which it simply has not been conducted before. And as long as I'm plugging my books, let me heartily recommend The Limits of Influence, which deals with macro PK, First Person Plural, which deals with multiple personality and the philosophy of mind, Crimes of Reason, which deals with a whole bunch of stuff, and lastly, The Gold Leaf Lady. If you want to know more about me, I have a easy-to-remember website in addition to not-so-easy-to-remember websites. It's jazzphilosopher.com. And that's the best I could do on half a cup of coffee. So I hope it's okay, and I'll be happy to take questions and see if I can answer them. Nan, where are you?
Coming back here. Just had to turn my mic back on. Excuse me. On a half a cup of coffee, you're clearer, more. Well, it's just much better than so many other presentations on multiple cups of coffee, I must say. I was in the middle of writing yet another indication that I feel that everybody needs to get a hold of all of your books. And I have, let me just click and finish that up. Thank you so much for this. Can we, as we go along, people, if you have questions and comments, put it in the chat as we go along. Maybe we can go back and forth in the PowerPoint. Adelson was saying when you were discussing this notion of what the discarnate communication would entail, he was saying, well, couldn't a prediction be that it just that the discarnate who is doing the communication has similar personality characteristics remaining in his toolbox as he had in life. And what I was thinking when I saw that was that, but what you're talking about was, even if that's true, how does that express itself? It's a very complex situation to express those remaining bits of personality in, back here with us, kind of thing. Did I misunderstand that?
Well, if we just say that consciousness or personality can survive, that doesn't mean that it can survive with all or some or none of one's ante-mortem abilities. So it's an auxiliary assumption that has to be tacked onto it, saying that some of our capacities can survive even in the absence of a functioning body and brain.
Exactly. I didn't catch. I think it was Patrizio who said, "Do you have an example of a case study that would support the survival versus the living agent psi hypothesis?"
I don't think it can be done so easily in terms of a single case. I mean, one of the things I argue for in Immortal Remains is that, one of the things that worked for me that made the evidence for survival ultimately a little more impressive than the evidence for living agent psi is the impressiveness of certain mediums over a long period of time. So the challenge for me was to explain how Mrs. Piper, for example, could give so much accurate information over a 25-year career.
There's certainly a cumulative effect, I think. I mean, for me, it was a combination of well, it started with meeting Carlos, because before that I was writing in and didn't think about anything except experimental work. But Piper and Garrett and a few other consistently good and unassailable in terms of honesty and investigations into how they were getting their information and all that stuff, that hit me over the head. And that combined with the drop-in communicators, because there's such a different type of experience, especially when the sitter group has to really do quite a lot of investigation to figure out how to verify this person who suddenly appears unexpectedly and is unknown to the sitters. That certainly seems to be a difficult situation to get around.
But when you actually look at the details of some of those cases, like the case of Runke's leg, as nifty as it is, there are some nagging concerns about the evidence. And the problem is that if you think just in terms of ideal cases, and I described two kinds of ideal cases in Immortal Remains, if we had an actual case that was as good as one of the ideal cases, I think we'd have to say that survival is a fact, even if we can't explain it. But it's hard to argue that any particular real case is at the ideal or approaches the ideal. And so that's where it gets difficult and a little hairy.
Yeah. Carlos is saying, was saying a few minutes ago, many do not consider the existence of the unconscious mind in the evaluation of survival research, survival evidence. And this is, of course, related to dissociation and other issues.
Right. Yes. I mean, if you read the accounts in the survival literature, mostly except for Jewel Eisenbud, the people who have a motive for simulating the evidence for survival are treated only like psychological stick figures. You have no idea what their real issues were in life, why they might have been deeply motivated. So in Immortal Remains, I discuss several cases that bring out just those kinds of issues. The Cagliostro case with Mrs. Chenoweth, the Sharada case of ostensible reincarnation with Xenoglossy. When you really start looking at what was going on in the lives and as far as we can tell, the minds of the people involved, in those cases, it's very plausible to posit real motives. And very few people in writing on survival actually look that deeply or even qualified to look that deeply into the unconscious or subconscious of the people
Yeah,
involved in the cases.
I always thought that one of the most, not one of the most important things, because I wouldn't want to put any of the things that you've done with the books that you've written and the articles you've written into the unimportant category, or make a hierarchy there. But one of the things that really struck me early on was the way that you would look at the reincarnation cases that Stevenson put together, and his not only lack of interest, which was unusual for a psychiatrist, in my opinion, in the psychological context of the experiencer, of the person or the person's family that was reporting all of these individual details, but also that other layer of depending on translators without someone, someone around that could render some kind of assistance on whether or not the translation was even close to what the original statements might have been, and how all of that handled. I mean, I understand that for him, logistically, it was impossible to be there on the ground doing all of the research himself and learn all the languages that were involved and gather information. So there was a methodological limitation there that really was something he had to work with, because that's what he was able to do. But it separates the researchers so far away from the psychological context of the experience that it makes a problem. And I don't think that even had occurred to me at all. I was super impressed by the reincarnation cases, front to back, every single one of them, and especially the ones that were as complex as Sharada. But until I read that article and started listening to the kinds of things you were saying about the assumptions on which Stevenson was working and his evaluation, and all of us as consumers were working and our evaluation of his work, it never occurred to me how complex these things are.
Right. I think it's a very good point. And Stevenson had a clear agenda. He wanted to marshal evidence of survival, and I respect that. But he did an incomplete job. And the ironic thing is that it was incomplete in precisely the domain in which he should have been able to make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Let me get you another question here, because there's a ton of them. Hold on a second here. Lisa is asking, on drop-in communications, I have experienced this when working with clients and past relatives suddenly drop in. Lisa is a medium. This is a distinct energetic signature different from me or my client. An energetic change occurs. Has anyone attempted to measure this, and how could it be measured? Are any instruments available to measure these kinds of things?
Not that I'm aware. Are you?
Mm-mm. No, I think at the moment, in Julie Beishel's work, for instance, and also in some of the work that Chris Rowe and Elizabeth Roxborough have been doing with the mediums from Arthur Findlay College, is relying on the way the way mediums talk about the feeling of the experience. Their description of how do I distinguish between an insight I'm getting from the sitter and an insight that feels like it's coming from a survived personality, a communication from a discarnate. And at the moment, that's all we can really do. I mean, there isn't any technological fix for this, and it's certainly a good place to start, though.
It's an interesting approach, and I encourage continued pursuit of that. But think about the various ways in which our subjective feelings can be misleading. I mean, that's how a lot of us get into lethal romantic entanglements.
Yes.
We feel there's something special about it, and it turns out that what's special is really not what we thought it was.
Right, exactly. Yep. Not going to comment. Prior to Carlos, I had a few of those. Hiram is saying, would it be acceptable to apply the term drop-in communications to specific indications of personhood obtained through instrumental transcommunication? The term drop-in communications is traditionally used in connection with mental mediumship, but could it apply to technical forms of mediumship?
I suppose it could, I guess, in the case, unless you're asking for some specific post-mortem individual to make sounds on your electronic equipment, then there could be drop-ins there too. My problem with the instrumental trance communication is that too often it's like a Rorschach test.
Yeah, it's that pareidolia thing where we listen and we can turn it into something. I think Cal talked about that a little bit in his presentation a couple weekends ago. Patricia is saying it seems to me that telepathy between a medium and another consciousness would be essentially the same, whether the consciousness is currently associated with a body or not. So why is there a reason to see telepathy and communication as different functions or different experiences?
Not sure I understand the question, but I mean, I agree that it's telepathy or clairvoyance, whether it's between living beings or between the living and the deceased. But that's precisely why the standard argument against the Super Psi or living agent Psi approach is so weak. I mean, you're positing seemingly equally impressive Psi no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's not a common way of looking at the interactions either, is to kind of think about, well, what would the discarnate person have to be utilizing to have these conversations or to make these various influences on the medium and the sitter group and so on. And I think that's really important to realize that it's not just the mechanism we need to explain is not just this, how the medium gets the communication, but how the heck, if there is a surviving consciousness, how that consciousness interacts back again with us.
Right.
Yeah, that's important. Carlos was adding Mrs. Leonard as one of the examples of well-documented and prolific a medium.
Yes.
And then Barry was asking, do you have an opinion on Swan on a Black Sea, Mrs. Willett? It's hard to explain her apparent continuing consciousness by a living agent Psi.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's the same issue that comes up in connection with Mrs. Piper and Mrs. Leonard. I mean, there are a number of really great mediums who seem to give impressive communications over a considerable period of time. I discuss that in terms of an argument that I call the argument from crippling complexity, which I'm dismayed to see that most of the people who cite it afterwards don't understand the argument.
Yeah. Let me go back over here. Marla is also saying, I have a curious question. Has there ever been any evidence or reported studies or instances of where upon death a consciousness enters the body of or attaches to another living person? And the reason why I asked this is because I attended a lecture of Stuart Swerdlow, who called this quantum leaping. And I don't know if he's a good, credible source for information.
I've never heard of that person. I don't know.
No, neither have I. I think that there are some cases. Aren't there some cases that I think the walk-in cases would be kind of that way? Some of these supposed shifts of trading of consciousness cases. Although the one that I either heard about or read about recently was one in which, when they went back to investigate whether or not this actually happened, it became kind of obvious that this was something that the journalist who wrote about it basically invented, as opposed to a real kind of walk-in case. So.
No, I don't know about that.
Okay, I think I have missed a couple of bits. Oh no, I've got it. Okay. Hiram was wondering whether or not the EEG studies by Arnaud Delorme would provide a sort of external objective evidence for there being something different going on when there's a communication as opposed to a telepathic encounter.
I don't know about that. I'd have to see how it's actually being put together.
I think that from my memory, from that chapter that Julie and I did for the handbook, Those were very preliminary experiments. They only used 4 individual mediums, and it was a short time of monitoring the EEGs. The mediums were asked to have a communication in one segment, imagine a communication in another segment, listen to Julie reading, because it was done with Julie Beischel, listen to a reading of a biography that Julie Beischel put together, and then another kind of a control session. And that it was only in one of the meetings, I think possibly 2, but I think more likely 1, where you saw some difference in the EEG functioning in terms of the areas of the brain that were being activated between what the medium was saying was a real communication as opposed to the pretend ones or the telepathic stuff and so on. So I think that's really early on. And Carlos, I don't know if you know of anything else along those lines, but that's all that I remember.
Trouble is, it's hard to know how to correlate what's going on in the brain with what the person's really thinking.
Exactly.
And it's hard to know what the person's really thinking.
Yeah, it's not a one-to-one, and then there's the memory of what you're thinking and how your language puts that together and all that ineffability stuff. And oh my God, things are always so much more complex than we think they are. Patrick is saying, has there been a previous discussion on how discarnate communication presents, as if the discarnate is still a physical system, such as a physical body, such as when the discarnate describes sensations or perceptions?
It's hard to know what to make of that. I mean, I actually wrote a paper on that at the Journal of Scientific Exploration. How to make sense even out of the claim that the communicator sees things in a way that ordinarily we can only explain in terms of a physical system and functioning eyes and ears.
Yeah, I agree.
It's a complex question. I think in fact, did I send you a paper?
You sent me a bunch of papers, and I haven't put them up in the frame yet, so I'm not sure what all I have. But if that one's there, that would be great.
It's on perspectival perception and postmortem survival.
Okay, I'll look for that.
I can't remember what I said.
Okay. Michael Nama saying, hi, Steve. Overall, Michael Soto seems to favor the living agent psi hypothesis, and you seem to favor the survival hypothesis. On the grounds of which arguments would you say you disagree with him?
Well, since I think it really comes down to weighing auxiliary assumptions, I can't defend my belief here about this on slam dunk purely scientific criteria. Ultimately, I think it comes down to our rational instincts about such things. And maybe it's because I'm more chronologically challenged than Michael, but there are some cases that I think come closer and closer to the theoretical ideal, and there are also some that, like the case of Mrs. Piper, whose success over extended periods of time just makes more sense in terms of crippling complexity than the alternative.
Yeah, exactly. It's how the evidence piles up often. That's another thing that I really appreciate about, not that my brain works like this anymore because age, but anyhow, one of the things I've really always appreciated about your work is that you focus on all of those unspoken assumptions. You bring them to light and then you critique them, and they're out there. And it's, for a lot of us, especially I think on the experimentalist side, not that I've done that much, but that's how I started. We just kind of take all that for granted. It's like, okay, we have a definition, we have an operationalism, we've got a methodology, and boof, we don't have to walk back and think about how did we get to that particular research question and why did it make sense and what are we assuming about the process or the methodology or the experience that we're not really thinking through, that we're just taking for granted or taking at face value or taking in terms of the description that we're reading of previous research or an experiencer's experience. And I think that's so important, because once people start moving their kind of analytical frame into your territory, moving it out of this kind of, okay, I've got this experiment to do or this survey to construct, and start thinking about everything that goes into our approach to a particular topic, not only does it become infinitely more complex, but we become more self-reflective about what is it that we're just glossing over that is actually key to our ability to interpret the data or interpret the experience.
Well, the experimental work is particularly weak in that respect, because most of the people who are conducting formal experiments seem to assume, for no decent reason whatsoever, that all the people involved in a parapsychological experiment are going to adhere to a kind of idiotic gentleman's agreement, where only the official subject will use only the psi ability being tested for, and then only when the experimenter's gun goes off at the appointed time. And that nobody else even remotely connected with the experiment will use whatever psi abilities they might have to muddy the evidential waters and to get the kind of results that they want.
Exactly. That's also one of the things that drew me to the checker effect stuff once the blessed Debbie Weiner, whose brain I wish we could get back into the field, got me up to speed on what we were doing, why that was important, and so on. It's like, why would that even happen? And every once in a while you hear like Joe McMoneagle gave a talk. I think it could have been just a conversation over hamburgers when we were at UVA, because we all used to go out to lunch together. But he kept saying, when I'm going to do a remote viewing session, I get information the day before and in my dreams, and maybe a week before when they schedule the session for me. It's not like it only happens when I'm sitting in that cage or sitting in that room trying to come up with the information. It's flowing through me as soon as the topic comes up, and expressing itself in different ways. And I've heard that from other psychics and mediums as well, that they have to kind of force themselves not to be pulling things from everywhere in any time, and that once they get to the sitter experience, the seance experience, or however it's done, the meeting experience, that they're basically reporting on all these other things that had come along. All the information they were going to get has already happened, and I'm sure the experimenter effect is a piece of evidence for this as well, because we're totally unconscious that we could be doing this, and then we don't put in any kind of methodological constraints, and maybe how could you to keep this from interfering. And I think that's where Bill Roll was trying to get in that whole system idea too, that it's just idiotic to think that everything is so cut and dried.
Well, especially if psi is at all need or interest relative or need determined, because the experimenter is certainly more invested in the outcome of the experiment than the participants are likely to be.
Yeah.
So really, the prospect of doing a controlled experiment in parapsychology seems to be a will-o'-the-wisp.
Yeah. Well, and in a sense, any psychological experiment, any sociological experiment, almost anything that requires human beings involved, there's always going to be something else happening. I remember, I think it was Rex Stanford at one point who said when he would go in to do his final test for his psychology students at St. John's, he just tried not to think about the fact that they might be getting their information from elsewhere.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Let's see. Elaine says, do you feel that the work following on from Ian Stevenson's research, such as that of Jim Tucker, has similar flaws to Stevenson's research?
Similar, yes. I think he's improved somewhat on what Ian did. But again, I don't see the kind of depth psychological analysis of the participants that we saw in the case of Jewel Eisenbud, for example, in the Cagliostro case. And in a way, it's forgivable. I mean, you have to do a certain kind of probing or hypothesizing, which not everybody is comfortable doing or capable of doing, or which may simply be impossible to do, given the relationship between the investigator and the people who are being investigated.
Yeah, very good point. Carlos put a link to one of his articles with the bibliography of modern publications about mental mediumship. And folks, all of you I have been sending this to you guys in my weekly emails to you so that you got it on hand as well. Hiram is also saying a short follow-up to my question was about the EEG research was, could use of, so might be another way to do this, could use of internet speech transcription platforms, which provide statistical confidence levels for interpreted phrases, eventually help parapsychologists overcome subjectivity reservations towards transcommunication, instrumental transcommunication. I'm saying could and eventually, because transcription is far from perfect now, especially for noisy signals in the audio.
I don't know. Subjectivity is built right into the algorithms for doing the translations.
Yeah, exactly. But we have to see if there's some way to punch that up. Carlos is saying, is there a problem with the Global Consciousness Project? I mean, alternate sources of influence other than the assumed ones?
Well, I don't want to get into a big discussion about whether the GCP material can best be explained as an experimenter effect or in terms of a group effect. I'm inclined to the experimenter effect interpretation.
It's always a very interesting conversation. In the past ParaMOOCs, whenever we've had someone who was presenting global consciousness and in a positive way, we've usually also had Peter Bancel to talk about the other side of it mathematically and so on. But definitely there's certainly room for that. If you've put one of those receptacles in your computer on purpose to contribute to the network, you're clearly interested in what the network is attempting to do. So I think you're probably right. And Hiram is saying, is there an article or an essay that's making comparisons between the limits of and auxiliary assumptions for living psi versus survival psi? That's something that you gave me, right? Or that we think you did.
Well, it hasn't been done systematically. I mean,
Okay.
I cover a lot of that in Immortal Remains, but not in the terms that now it's being framed by Michael Sedeth. But I certainly deal a lot with the auxiliary assumptions from the living agent psi angle in Immortal Remains. So at least they're out there. And one thing I would say is that in many cases we have certain avenues of justification for the auxiliary assumptions, because we can make credible suggestions about why the medium or the child or the parents in a reincarnation case might have been motivated to simulate evidence for survival. The auxiliary assumptions needed for the survival psi explanations are much more difficult to make credible conjectures about. I mean, why it should be easy or difficult to communicate in the afterlife, why the evidence should take the particular form that it does. So I think there's a lot more we can say about people we actually know something about than about a domain that we're not even sure exists yet.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as I said before, guys, get Immortal Remains. Have all Stephen Braude books on your shelf.
Yes, I'll be happy to sign the books and decrease their value.
Carlos is giving up a link to Sudha's book. Anybody have any more questions or comments?
I'm ready for breakfast.
Oh, and no breakfast too. Yeah, I had crackers and cheese while I was on the phone with you and right after. I'm sorry about the mix up on the time. Next time we'll burn it in our brain somehow.
Few things are uglier than a hungry, tired philosopher.
Well, considering that you're hungry and tired and still in your jammies, I think you're doing a fantastic job here. Hiram says, I have Immortal Remains and Crimes of Reasons, and I'm going to go back and look for the discussion of the assumptions there. Thanks. Yeah, we have everything. Carlos says, go have some pancakes with sausages.
Don't say sausage to a former pig owner.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Yeah. Hamlet was such a sweet thing. And Carlos actually had a Puerto Rican breakfast dish, which is white rice with 2 fried eggs on top. It's called caballo, I think. Carlos, you should say, which means like a horse with a saddle, kind of a metaphorical name for the dish, and it's actually wonderful.
You're torturing me talking about food. Don't
oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Any other questions or comments, folks? We're at about 1 hour 15, so we're doing good here. Everybody's saying thank you. Adelson said, "Is there evidence for survival for animals?"
It's hard to know what that would look like.
Yeah. I mean, I've had a number of experiences after our cats have passed of, feeling like the cat is on the bed or is jumping in front of me or seeing a glimpse of a tail going by, that kind of thing. But I miss them terribly at the time that those things happen. So I've never been able to convince myself that it's anything other than wishful thinking.
What you can't get in those cases is information or abilities that are uniquely associated with the deceased.
Yes, so. Exactly. Although there was a wonderful old story that Carol E. Werner, who used to be the editor of the Journal of the American Society for Psychical Research, they had a cat who had learned at a young age how to stretch up and open a door that did not have it had a metal doorknob, so it wasn't conducive to getting a good grip on it and opening the door. And she had figured out how to do that, this little kitty. And about 6 months after the cat passed, which was many years later, they adopted a stray kitten who was around their farm. And the kitten, when it came into the house, immediately figured out, like went to the door and opened the door in the same manner. So she used to joke around that Stevenson needed to do another book called Cases of the now I've forgotten, it was like Cases of Kitty Reincarnation or something like that. So she would always say that cat was probably a reincarnation, but we don't know. Adelson was saying he was asking because some mediums will talk about animal survival.
Well, I mean, if humans can survive, I don't see why animals couldn't as well. But again, that's another area of assumptions that we make. One of the things, even if we have evidence, if we agree that there's evidence of survival, there is no evidence that everybody survives. At best, it would be evidence that some people survive, and then only for a limited time.
Yeah.
So we have to be very careful about what conclusions we draw from the evidence, even as good as it is.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly right. Any other questions or comments, folks? I think we're winding down at this point. We have a couple of people typing.
Show some pity on a hungry philosopher.
Yeah, that's it. Janine says, now I want pancakes. And then Carlos is saying, great talk. Thank you so much. And so informative, Esther says. Well, we won't keep you from your breakfast any longer. And thank you so much for rolling with this punch. And we'll never do this to you again in the future. I promise.
I hope it was
semi-articulate.
I hope it was semi-articulate.
Oh, your semi-articulate is way beyond most people's articulateness, so I'm not worried about that at all. It was absolutely very interesting, and you made a lot of wonderful points and got us all thinking. And I think the fact that we went almost a whole half hour with the discussion is evidence that was very thought-provoking for everybody.
Thank you.
And so you're getting a lot of virtual applause. So thank you so much, Steve. We really appreciate having you here and having you close out this year's ParaMOOC. We always like to end on a very strong note, and we have done that. I just want to let everybody know tomorrow is the closing session and discussion forum. It will also be at noon Eastern. This will not go up on YouTube. You will have a recording in the classroom, and it will be on the Google Drive when I get that all finished up. We'll be talking about the course and how we enjoyed it, what was going on, giving you an opportunity to weigh in on what the theme should be for next year's ParaMOOC. and also talking about the potential for a monthly discussion forum, either in this framework or in the virtual world Second Life, where the Alvarado Zingrodi Institute for Research and Education exists in a semi-physical form, which is in a virtual world. Anyway, so Hiram is saying, enjoy your breakfast. Salutations from Maryland. And now Carla says, go for the heavy maple syrup. Only a diabetic would, lean into all of that sugar. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
I'm going to sign off.
Okay. Have a great day. And so sorry to yank you out of bed so fast.
It's all right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Bye, everybody.